Lately, it seemed like Leela and I were barely living in the same world, let alone the same house. Arguments crept into every part of our lives. Little things became big things. Every conversation felt like it could spark a quarrel, and the warmth we once had felt like a distant memory. I'd catch her glancing at her phone, her face tense, sometimes smiling faintly at messages that she quickly stashed away. When I asked, she'd say it was just work. But the energy between us had shifted. Every excuse, every late-night work meeting, and every half-hearted explanation just seemed to pull her further away. It wasn't always this way. We'd had 2 good years together, years that felt as easy as breathing. I once thought I'd found someone I could share everything with. I'd even seen a future with her. We talked about travel, about where we'd live when we were ready to settle down. But somewhere along the way, our plans seemed to disappear, replaced by silence and avoidance. She started staying out later, claiming she had to meet colleagues for work sessions, or saying she'd run into a friend who needed support. One night, the tension was thicker than ever. We had argued earlier about something as trivial as what to have for dinner, but it escalated so quickly. She was quieter than usual, her responses curt, as if talking to me was more of a chore than anything else. Then, out of nowhere, she mentioned she had to leave to check on a friend. She left, offering me a hollow goodnight, and I was left staring at the door. The room felt emptier than it should have, like she'd taken something more than just her coat with her. I wasn't sure when things had changed, only that they had. Part of me wanted to believe her, that maybe it really was work stress, or that something was going on with her family that she didn't want to burden me with. But every excuse she gave seemed shakier than the last. She stopped wanting to talk about her day, avoided eye contact, and acted like our fights were just part of the background noise of her life. I found myself studying her, looking for some small clue to explain it all. And then it happened. After another night of tension and silence, I got a text from my friend Mark. He'd been at a party that night, a party I'd skipped because I was hoping to spend time with Leela. But Mark wasn't messaging to check in on me. He was texting about Leela. His message was quick, with an uneasy tone. "Saw Leela tonight. Wasn't alone," he wrote. He didn't elaborate immediately, and I found myself gripping my phone so tightly that my knuckles turned white. Before I could respond, another message came through. "She was with Jason. Thought you'd want to know. Got a video." I didn't know whether to laugh, to ignore it, or to throw my phone across the room. Jason was someone she'd known from college, someone she'd always described as an old friend. He was a name that occasionally came up in stories, usually accompanied by a smile or a laugh. But now, just the thought of him made my blood run cold. And then Mark sent the video. I hesitated, my finger hovering over the play button, but I knew there was no going back. The clip was short, and the image was grainy, but there was no mistaking it was Leela, standing close to Jason on the patio, her hand on his arm, laughing in a way that felt far too familiar. They leaned in, and suddenly, they were kissing. I had a strange moment of disbelief, as if I were watching a scene from someone else's life. But the sting was real. That was my wife, and she was kissing another man. For a few minutes, I was frozen, just staring at the screen, replaying the scene, looking for some reason, some hint that it wasn't what it seemed. Maybe it was a joke, a one-off moment, something that could be explained away. But deep down, I knew the truth. The woman who'd told me she was going to check on a friend was here, at a party, with someone she'd never mentioned in that way. I found myself overwhelmed, not just by anger but by a strange calm. It was as if the shock numbed everything, making it impossible to react immediately. My thoughts raced, forming a jumble of questions and accusations. Part of me wanted to call her, to demand answers, to make her explain everything right there and then. But another part held back. This wasn't a confrontation I wanted to rush into. I wanted to know more. The facts, as harsh as they were, wouldn't change, but my approach to dealing with them had to be careful. So, I didn't text her. I didn't call. Instead, I scrolled back through my messages with Leela, replaying conversations, noting where things felt off, where her words had seemed strange. Every little inconsistency began to build a timeline, a narrative that wasn't flattering, and I knew then that I couldn't look at her the same way again. In the following days, I became more observant, silently cataloging every shift in her behavior. The night after I received that video, I kept an emotional distance, pretending nothing had changed while I watched her closely. She didn't seem any different. If anything, she was her usual, detached self, moving through the motions without a second thought about us. But I saw it all now, the careful lies, the half-truths, and the long, tired silences. She thought I was still oblivious, that she had the upper hand, and in a way, she did until I knew exactly what to do next. That night, as she lay beside me, I could feel the space widening, the gap that she'd carved out with her secrecy and lies. I'd always believed in trusting my partner, always thought that honesty was the foundation of what we'd built. But as I stared at the ceiling, listening to her breathing, I felt something shift inside me. Trust had been replaced by suspicion, love by a cold determination to find out everything. She'd made her choices, and now I'd make mine. I woke up the next morning feeling the weight of the video pressing down on me, like a splinter I couldn't shake loose. Images of Leela and Jason haunted me, even as I tried to push them away. The memory of them laughing, close together on that patio, seared itself into my mind. But I wasn't ready to confront her, not yet. There was too much I didn't know, and the last thing I wanted was to go into this unprepared. Confrontation would come, but only after I understood the full picture. Leela acted like it was any other day. She moved around the house, making coffee, asking if I needed anything, as though she hadn't been out with another man the night before. Her calmness was unsettling, and for the first time, I wondered how long she had been hiding things from me. I watched her closely, my mind trying to unravel the person I thought I knew. Her mask was so perfectly in place that even I found myself questioning what I'd seen. But the evidence was clear, and no amount of small talk could change that. Later that day, I got another message from Mark. He confirmed what I feared. This wasn't a one-time thing. "I've seen her with him a few times now," he texted, adding that other friends had also noticed. My anger flared, but I managed to keep it bottled up. If this was true, then confronting her without more knowledge would only give her a chance to cover her tracks. The last thing I wanted was for her to spin a story or twist the truth to save herself. I needed undeniable proof. So, I went about my days pretending nothing was wrong, all while keeping an eye on her. The arguments continued, but now they felt like background noise. Leela would pick fights over small things: dishes left in the sink, an empty toilet paper roll, or the way I left my shoes by the door. Her irritation seemed out of proportion, almost as if she wanted to provoke a reaction from me. But I wouldn't give her the satisfaction. I'd only watch, listen, and wait. One evening, we had a particularly tense exchange over dinner. She was accusing me of being emotionally distant, of not caring about the relationship. It took every ounce of control not to laugh at the absurdity. Here she was, accusing me of pulling away, while she was the one sneaking around with someone else. I said nothing, letting her words fall flat in the silence that followed. I watched her face, saw the flash of confusion when I didn't respond, and something clicked. This wasn't guilt talking. This was projection. She needed a reason to justify her actions, to shift the blame onto me. That night, after Leela left the house again, supposedly to help a friend work through some things, I sat alone in the living room, going over everything I knew. It wasn't much, but it was enough to paint an outline. She was lying to me, meeting Jason when she said she was elsewhere, and doing so repeatedly. This wasn't some mistake or spur-of-the-moment lapse. This was premeditated betrayal. I couldn't sit in the dark any longer, not knowing the extent of her deceit. If I was going to confront her, I needed more. I called a close friend, Tom, who was as level-headed as they come. I explained the situation briefly, leaving out the raw details, just enough so he knew what was going on. "Ethan, I hate to say it, but you need to be sure. This could turn ugly fast," he said, his voice laced with caution. He suggested keeping my distance emotionally and staying calm, even if it was the hardest thing to do. "Don't give her any sign that you're onto her," he advised. "If she's hiding something, it'll surface." With Tom's advice in mind, I began piecing together a plan. I'd look through her phone, her emails, her messages, anything that could give me insight. She had become careful, guarded even, but I knew her habits. Her phone was often left unattended when she showered or got ready for bed, and if I waited for the right moment, I could look without arousing suspicion. The opportunity came a few days later. She had gone upstairs to shower, leaving her phone charging on the kitchen counter. My heart raced as I picked it up, scrolling through her messages, hoping for something, anything, that would confirm what I already knew. Her texts were oddly clean, almost too clean, with nothing beyond surface-level conversations with colleagues or friends. It was as though she had scrubbed every trace of Jason from her life. But that itself was telling. Leela wasn't normally this guarded with her phone. Then I checked her emails. I wasn't expecting much, but as I scrolled down, I found an email that stood out. It was from a private email address, with only a few words in the subject line. Tonight, same place? The body of the message was blank. The sender's name was just an initial J. My stomach churned. I didn't need a full name to know it was Jason. She had deleted the rest of their conversation, but this one slip-up was all I needed. That night, she came home late, her hair slightly damp and smelling faintly of cigarette smoke, a habit she'd picked up recently. I could hardly look at her. The pieces were finally falling into place, and her secrecy felt like a betrayal deeper than anything I could have imagined. I went to bed early, letting her believe I was just tired, and laid there in the dark, trying to hold on to what little sanity I had left. The next few days were a blur. I began keeping a record, jotting down every suspicious moment, every excuse, every unexplained absence. I watched her as one might observe a stranger, noticing things I hadn't seen before. The way she'd get defensive if I asked about her day, the tension in her jaw when she thought I wasn't looking, the way her phone was always angled away from me. One night, I noticed her looking at her reflection in the mirror before heading out. She was checking her hair, adjusting her clothes, and making sure everything was perfect. She'd never done that for work meetings before. As she left, I felt a strange calm wash over me. This time, I knew exactly where she was going and who she was meeting. I'd seen enough, gathered enough pieces to understand the person she had become. The hardest part of all was the waiting. It felt as though my life had become a game of patience, a quiet battle between holding on and letting go. But I knew I couldn't confront her just yet. Not until I had something undeniable, something she couldn't explain away with another excuse. And so I held back, biding my time, letting her dig herself deeper into the lies she spun so effortlessly. Each day was a new test, a new layer of deception, but I felt a strength growing inside me, a resolve that came from the knowledge that, soon enough, the truth would come out. The next week brought a surprising twist I hadn't anticipated. I was scheduled to attend a business conference out of town, a trip I had invited Leela to join me on, but she declined, saying she needed to stay and finish a project. So, I packed alone, more out of obligation than enthusiasm, thinking the time away might give me some clarity on the mess my life had become. The first day of the conference was uneventful. I kept to myself, half listening to presentations, but my mind was elsewhere, churning through the familiar loop of questions and betrayals. But the day took a turn when I heard a familiar voice behind me during a coffee break. I turned around and there she was, Haley, my first love from years ago, someone I hadn't seen since we'd both gone our separate ways after college. She looked as surprised as I felt. "Ethan? I can't believe it's really you," she said, laughing in that way that felt instantly familiar. The years seemed to melt away in that moment, and for the first time in days, I felt a sense of ease. Haley was still the same, her warm, open smile, her laugh that somehow made everything feel lighter. We talked for a while, catching up on each other's lives, exchanging bits and pieces about the past years. She was working in marketing now, traveling often for work, still as driven as she'd been back then. Our conversation quickly moved beyond the typical "what have you been up to" topics, and we settled into the same natural rhythm we'd once shared. There was a kind of honesty between us that hadn't faded, and I realized how much I missed talking to someone who felt real, who wasn't hiding behind secrets or lies. That evening, we agreed to meet up for dinner. The connection between us was undeniable, and for once, I wasn't looking back at my phone, wondering where Leela was or who she was with. Haley and I talked for hours, covering everything from work to family to memories of our old college days. It was refreshing to share stories without feeling the weight of pretense. And as the night wore on, I found myself telling her about my marriage, about the distance, the strange silences, and the suspicions I couldn't shake. Haley listened without judgment, her eyes soft and understanding. "I'm sorry, Ethan," she said quietly, reaching across the table to give my hand a squeeze. "No one deserves to go through that. And I know it must be hard, especially after everything you thought you had together." Her words were a balm I hadn't realized I needed. Our dinner ended late, and as we walked back, I felt a pull I hadn't felt in a long time. This was someone who understood me, who remembered the person I used to be before everything became so complicated. Haley represented a time in my life when things were simpler, and I found myself drawn to that simplicity, that honest connection that seemed so elusive now. Part of me felt guilty for feeling so much ease around her, but another part, a stronger part, reminded me that I hadn't done anything wrong. I was simply reconnecting with an old friend, someone who knew me, the real me, in a way Leela no longer did. As we reached her hotel, Haley turned to me with a smile. "Thank you, Ethan. For tonight, it was really good to see you," she said, and for a moment, there was something unspoken between us. We lingered, both of us aware of a spark we couldn't deny. "Maybe we can do this again before the conference ends?" she suggested. I nodded, feeling a warmth in her words that had been missing in my life for too long. We said our goodbyes, and I watched her go, feeling lighter, as if some burden had lifted. The next day, we met up again, and then again the day after that. Each evening, we fell into the same comfortable rhythm, sharing more of ourselves, both aware of the unspoken history between us. By the end of the conference, I knew I was walking a fine line. Haley's presence had stirred something in me I thought was long gone, a desire for closeness, for companionship without the weight of distrust. It wasn't revenge that drove me to her. It was something far deeper, something real. Spending time with Haley reminded me of who I was before the mistrust and disappointment took over my life. On the last evening, as we sat overlooking the city, Haley turned to me, her expression serious. "Ethan, I don't want to overstep, but maybe this distance between you and Leela isn't something you can fix alone," she said gently. "You deserve to be with someone who values you." Her words hit a nerve. For so long, I'd been holding on to the hope that Leela and I could find our way back, that the arguments and suspicion were just a rough patch. But sitting there with Haley, I felt the truth settle, and I had been fighting for something that was slipping further out of reach each day. Haley had given me a glimpse of what my life could look like, free from the tangled web of lies and uncertainty. It was a life that felt peaceful, genuine, a life I realized I missed more than I'd admitted to myself. I left the conference knowing I couldn't just go back to pretending everything was fine. Meeting Haley had shaken me, had forced me to confront the truth I'd been avoiding. I couldn't unsee the possibilities she'd reminded me of. It was time to stop holding on to someone who couldn't give me the respect and love I needed. Haley had shown me that I didn't have to settle for half-truths and suspicion. As I drove back, I thought of Leela. She didn't know it yet, but this quiet reunion had changed everything. Meeting Haley had given me a new strength, a sense of clarity. I knew I couldn't keep living in the shadows of Leela's deceit. And though I hadn't planned on it, I felt a quiet resolve building. I was done being the one left in the dark. Returning home after the conference, I felt an unexpected calm, a clarity I hadn't experienced in months. I still hadn't confronted Leela about Jason, hadn't thrown accusations or asked questions. Instead, I began pulling away, not out of anger, but from a quiet determination. I decided I'd mirror the distance she created, let her feel the shift in my attention, the way my focus had slipped away from her. The silent withdrawal was my way of signaling that things between us had changed. Leela noticed almost immediately. I stopped asking about her late nights, no longer questioning the vague explanations she offered. When she'd leave the house, I'd offer a simple, "See you later," without the slightest hint of curiosity about where she was going or who she was meeting. In the past, I'd been the one trying to keep us connected, working to close the gap between us. Now, I let it grow. Haley and I kept in touch as well. We texted, sometimes late into the night, each message reminding me of the genuine connection I felt with her. There was no pretense, no secrets between us. I wasn't being underhanded. I was simply choosing to spend my time with someone who brought out the best in me, who made me feel valued. Every conversation with Haley felt like a quiet act of defiance against the lies Leela had surrounded me with. Leela started noticing my absence, even when I was physically present. She'd bring up past arguments, trying to bait me into reacting, but I didn't bite. Instead, I'd nod, agree to whatever she suggested, and give her nothing more. The more I detached, the more she seemed unsettled. I could tell she was feeling it, the way my loyalty to her had silently slipped away. It was subtle, but it was there a quiet rebellion that left her scrambling to regain control. One night, as Leela was heading out once again, she paused in the doorway, casting a hesitant glance my way. "I'll be late," she said, almost as though testing to see if I'd press her for more details. But I just shrugged, giving her an easy smile. "All right, have a good night." The confusion on her face was undeniable, and for the first time, I saw a flash of uncertainty in her eyes. She was losing the upper hand, and she knew it. After she left, I met up with Haley. We shared a simple meal, talking about everything and nothing, the comfortable silence between us broken only by laughter. Spending time with her wasn't an act of vengeance, it was a reminder of what a real connection felt like. There was no guilt, no resentment, just the realization that I didn't have to accept being taken for granted. Being with Haley allowed me to feel like myself again, and that was a freedom I'd been missing for too long. As weeks passed, Leela became more anxious, more desperate to bring back the arguments that once held us together. But I stayed steady, letting her flail against the silence I left in place of the arguments. Every time she tried to pick a fight, I'd offer her a level-headed response, devoid of any emotional pull. It was no longer about winning or losing, it was about letting her realize that my attention had shifted, that she no longer held the place in my heart she once did. Then one evening, she confronted me directly, her eyes a mixture of frustration and desperation. "You don't even care anymore, do you?" she demanded, her voice shaking. I met her gaze calmly. Maybe I finally realized that fighting isn't worth it. I paused, letting the silence fill the space between us. "You were right about a lot of things, Leela. I just took a little longer to see it." She looked at me, bewildered, maybe even hurt. But this was no longer about us or our fractured past, it was about the quiet power I'd found in letting go. I didn't need to shout, accuse, or demand answers anymore. My silence had become my statement, a subtle revenge that needed no explanation. She was left facing the space she had created, and for the first time, I could tell she was beginning to feel the same emptiness I'd felt for so long. And that was enough. Leela had been pushing for a getaway for weeks, insisting that a vacation might help us reset. It was her last-ditch attempt to patch things up, an attempt to force us into close quarters and pretend the fractures weren't there. I agreed, not because I thought it would work, but because I knew something she didn't. This trip was already doomed. I'd invited Haley to join me, secretly booking her a separate room at the same resort. It wasn't something I did lightly, but after everything I'd uncovered, I felt justified. I wanted Leela to finally see the truth that she no longer had a monopoly on my loyalty, that her deceit had consequences she couldn't control. The first few days were a facade of normalcy. Leela tried her best to play the devoted partner, suggesting activities and trying to spark old memories. I went along with it, but my mind was elsewhere, anticipating the quiet reveal that I knew would come soon enough. Each time she'd suggest a romantic dinner or a stroll along the beach, I could see the tension in her smile, the uncertainty that had crept into her every gesture. She knew, on some level, that things weren't right, that I wasn't really there with her. Then, one evening, it all unraveled. We had planned to meet for dinner at the resort's restaurant, but before heading there, I told Leela I needed some time to myself. She accepted it without question, assuming I was just wandering the resort grounds. But I wasn't alone. Haley and I took a walk along the beach, the sun dipping below the horizon as we strolled, laughing at old memories and talking about plans. For the first time in a long time, I felt a sense of peace, a genuine happiness that hadn't been part of my life in months. As fate would have it, Leela came across us. She must have been on her way to the restaurant when she saw us walking together, my hand resting comfortably on Haley's arm. Her face shifted from surprise to something closer to rage, her eyes dark and piercing. She stormed toward us, her voice trembling as she demanded, "What the hell is going on here, Ethan?" I let go of Haley's arm and turned to face her calmly. "Leela, this is Haley. We met again recently. I thought I deserved to have someone who respects me." The color drained from her face as she struggled to process my words. "You brought her here," she sputtered, her voice a mixture of disbelief and fury. "You wanted this, didn't you? To rub it in my face?" Her words were raw, accusatory, as though I had betrayed her, but I could see something else flickering beneath the anger realization. She was seeing, for the first time, the consequences of her actions, and she didn't like it. I shook my head, keeping my tone steady. "Leela, I'm not the one who started this. I try to make things work, to be there for you. But you chose something else, someone else. All I did was stop pretending I didn't know." She opened her mouth, then closed it, as though searching for a defense she didn't have. It's not that simple, Ethan," she stammered, her voice softer, but still laced with anger. "I wouldn't have done what I did if you hadn't been so distant." "So distant?" I interrupted, a bitter laugh escaping me. "Leela, I was there. You were the one slipping away, leaving for work, hiding your messages. I was just the one who finally stopped pretending." Haley had taken a few steps back, giving us space, and I was grateful for it. This moment wasn't about her, it was about Leela and the life she had dismantled one secret at a time. Leela looked at me, her expression a mixture of anger and something that almost looked like regret, but I knew better. Regret was something she would only feel when she truly understood what she'd lost. That night, she didn't join me at dinner. I found her in our room afterward, sitting on the edge of the bed, staring out at the ocean through the open balcony doors. She looked up as I entered, her face unreadable. "You didn't have to do it like this," she said quietly. "No," I replied, feeling a calm resolve settle over me. "But you left me with few choices. I was willing to work things out, to talk through whatever was wrong. But you pushed me away, over and over. I just found my own path." She nodded, a hollow look in her eyes, and for the first time, I saw her truly grasp the impact of her choices. She was left sitting in the silence she had created, the distance she had carved between us now an unbridgeable gap. As I left the room, I realized that my own peace was worth more than any confrontation, more than any attempt to force things back to what they had been. Haley waited for me outside, and as I joined her, the sense of freedom I felt was profound. For the first time, I was stepping out of the shadows, leaving the weight of betrayal behind me. Leela had wanted a reset, but she'd never expected that it would mean me moving forward without her. And finally, I was ready to do just that. The next morning, I woke to find Leela already dressed, her back turned as she stood by the balcony, gazing out at the horizon. There was a tension in her posture, and I knew that last night's events were still on her mind, gnawing away. I wasn't looking to argue, but I could sense that this conversation was inevitable, and in some way, I was ready for it. After a moment, she turned to face me, her expression guarded. "Ethan," she began, her voice unusually soft, "we need to talk." I nodded, gesturing for her to continue, but instead of speaking, she hesitated, struggling to find the right words. Finally, she exhaled, lowering her gaze. I know you saw what happened with Jason. I'm not going to deny it," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "It was a mistake, but it happened." There it was. The confirmation I had already known, but hearing it from her made it all the more real. I felt a strange calm wash over me, as though the storm of emotions had finally passed, leaving only clarity in its wake. I stayed silent, letting her continue, watching her unravel as she tried to justify what couldn't be justified. It wasn't what you think," she added quickly, glancing up to meet my gaze, her eyes pleading. "Things between us were tense, Ethan. You were distant. You were always caught up in work, in your own world, and I felt like I was alone in this marriage." Her words were laced with excuses, an attempt to lay the blame at my feet. But I wasn't buying it. I met her gaze, steady and unwavering. "I was distant?" I repeated, my voice calm but firm. "Leela, I was there. I showed up every day, try to make things work, but it was you who drifted away. You stopped talking, stopped sharing. Every time I asked, you pulled further back. I might have been there in silence, but I was there. It was you who chose not to be. She opened her mouth as if to respond, then stopped, her shoulders slumping in defeat. I know, she murmured, her voice barely audible. But Jason, he was just, I don't know, a distraction? Someone who made me feel less. She trailed off, struggling for words that could excuse her actions. A distraction? I echoed, shaking my head. Do you even hear yourself, Leela? You're justifying something that you knew would destroy us. And now you're calling it a mistake because it's convenient. Leela's face crumpled as the weight of her actions seemed to settle on her fully for the first time. I'm sorry, she whispered, her voice choked with emotion. I never meant to hurt you. I thought we could fix this. Her apology rang hollow. I wanted to believe her, to think there was some genuine remorse beneath her words. But I had given her every chance, every opportunity to come clean, to rebuild what we'd lost. And each time, she'd chosen lies over honesty, secrecy over trust. The damage was done, and I could see it in her eyes that she knew it too. Taking a deep breath, I looked at her, feeling a strange, bittersweet sense of finality. Leela, I don't think there's anything left to fix, I said quietly. For a long time, I thought we could work through it, that I could somehow bring us back to where we were. But last night, seeing you, watching you react, I realized something. She looked up, her eyes filled with desperation, but I held my ground. You don't get to choose when it matters to be faithful or honest. And you don't get to decide when I'm supposed to be there for you. I was there, Leela, but you weren't. And now, I think it's time for me to walk away. Her face fell, and for a moment, she looked as if she might protest, but then her shoulders slumped in resignation. She knew, deep down, that this was the end. There was no going back, no reset button. She had pushed me away, and now she was left alone to face the reality of what she'd done. I'm sorry, Ethan, she said again, her voice breaking. I really am. I nodded, accepting her words, but feeling no satisfaction in them. I know you are, I replied, my tone softer than I expected. But sometimes, sorry isn't enough. The silence that filled the room was heavy, weighted with the finality of our conversation. I took one last look at her, this woman I had once loved, the woman who had turned into someone I barely recognized. I felt a sense of closure, a release from the pain and betrayal that had held me captive for so long. Without another word, I turned and left the room, stepping into the warm sunlight outside. Haley was waiting for me by the beach, her face calm but concerned as she watched me approach. When I reached her, she placed a gentle hand on my shoulder, giving me a quiet strength I hadn't known I needed. Are you all right? She asked softly. I nodded, a weight lifting from my chest. Yeah, I replied, looking out over the ocean, feeling a newfound sense of peace. I think I am. The truth had come out, but more than that, I had finally let go of the past, of the lies and the pain. And as I stood there with Haley, I knew I was ready for whatever came next, free from the shadows of betrayal and open to a new beginning. As we left the resort, a quiet calm settled over me. For the first time in a long time, I felt like I could finally breathe. Everything I'd once held onto, the plans, the future I'd envisioned with Leela, was gone, yet I didn't feel empty. Instead, I felt lighter, as if a weight I'd carried for too long had been lifted. The truth was out, and I was free to start over without the lies and mistrust that had haunted my life. Haley was by my side as we boarded the plane, her presence comforting and steady. She didn't push me to talk about what had happened with Leela, and I was grateful for that. She understood the quiet I needed, the space to process everything and close that chapter. The thought of returning to a life free from deception, one where I didn't have to wonder if I was being played or lied to, was a relief I could hardly describe. Back home, I took things slowly, one day at a time. Haley and I continued to see each other, taking long walks, having dinners that felt easy and real. There were no secrets, no hidden agendas, just two people genuinely enjoying each other's company. The simplicity was refreshing. a stark contrast to the twisted, tangled mess I'd been living in. Haley didn't replace what I'd lost. Instead, she opened the door to something new, something I could trust and believe in. Leela, meanwhile, had tried reaching out a few times, sending messages that ranged from apologies to pleas for us to reconsider. I could see she hadn't fully accepted the finality of what had happened, and part of me felt a pang of sympathy. But I knew that going back wasn't an option, not after everything that had been said, not after the clear betrayal she'd chosen time and again. I replied only once with a short message. "I've moved on, Leela. Please respect that." It was the truth, and I hoped she'd find her own way forward as I was finding mine. With each passing day, I felt more grounded, more certain of who I was and what I wanted. Haley and I took a trip to the coast a few months later, a simple getaway, but it felt monumental to me. We stayed in a small, quiet beach town, spending our days exploring and our evenings sitting by the fire, wrapped in easy conversation. There was no drama, no tension, just the quiet understanding that comes from two people who respect each other. One evening, as we watched the waves under the fading light, Haley looked at me, her eyes soft but serious. "Ethan, I know you've been through a lot. I don't want to rush anything, but I just want you to know that I'm here for whatever comes next." Her words were simple, but they struck a chord. I realized then that I hadn't just left behind a broken relationship, I'd also left behind the part of myself that had been willing to settle for less than I deserved. I wanted a relationship built on mutual respect, honesty, and trust, and Haley had shown me what that could look like. I reached for her hand, feeling the warmth of her fingers lacing through mine. "Thank you, Haley, for everything," I said, meaning every word. She'd been my anchor through the storm, but now she was more than that. She was a part of the new life I was building, one that no longer carried the shadows of betrayal. When we returned from the coast, I found myself with a renewed sense of purpose. I started taking on new projects at work, even began volunteering at a local community center on the weekends. I found fulfillment in things outside of any relationship, reconnecting with the parts of myself that had been neglected. With each day, I felt more complete, more like the person I wanted to be. As the months went by, Haley and I continued to grow closer. It wasn't a whirlwind romance. It was steady, grounded, real. She was patient, kind, and everything I hadn't realized I needed. We didn't talk about the future in grand, sweeping plans. Instead, we simply enjoyed each moment as it came, knowing that the foundation we were building was solid. Looking back, I could see that Leela's betrayal had shattered something in me, but it had also cleared the way for something new, something better. It had forced me to confront truths I might have avoided, and had shown me the importance of choosing people who value honesty and loyalty. The pain had been real, but it had also been the catalyst for a new beginning, a chance to rebuild on my own terms. On a quiet Sunday morning, as Haley and I sat on my porch, sipping coffee and watching the sunrise, I felt a sense of peace that I hadn't known in years. The chaos, the lies, the betrayal, they were all in the past. I was no longer bound by them, no longer defined by someone else's choices. I was finally free, ready to embrace the life that lay ahead with someone who respected me, someone who valued the same truths I did. As the sun rose higher, casting a warm glow over everything, I looked at Haley and knew that I'd found what I'd been searching for all along, not just in a partner, but in myself. And for the first time, I felt truly whole, ready to move forward, unburdened by the past. This was my new beginning, and I was ready for every moment of it.